Hi, my name is Lee Beckwith, and I'm excited to talk to you about how I was able to rethink the power dynamics in my classroom through curriculum negotiation. The seeds of this project were planted towards the end of my first year as a fellow when we read David Labourie's book, Someone Has to Fail. There was one sentence that really stuck with me. He writes, "The teacher-pupil relationship is a form of institutionalized domination and subordination." Here, Laborie conceptualizes the power dynamic between teacher and student pretty harshly. I was struck by this way of representing the teacher-student relationship and wondered if there was a way to make it a bit more equitable. This led me to the central tension I identified in my teaching practice. Is it possible to be an effective educator without utilizing external power to make students do things? If I look at my own formal educational experiences to answer this question, the answer would be no. For the vast majority of my time as a student, I had very little say in what I learned or how I learned it. I would just come in, sit at my desk, and do as I was told. It was only during my senior year of college, 17 years into my formal education, that I was finally granted more pedagogical agency in two high-level electives. I was able to work with my professors and peers to figure out what we would learn and how we would learn it. I was curious if I could bring this sort of experience to my own high school students. During my last June week, Sonia helped me realize that what I was ultimately wanting to practice in my classroom was negotiation, when multiple people with different wants and needs come together and reach some sort of agreement. This led me to my inquiry question, which was, how can I create a classroom where all students can negotiate their needs as learners? I was not the first person to ask this question. There's lots of literature on curriculum negotiation. Francis Edwards defines curriculum negotiation as, quote, "a dynamic process in which what is taught and learned is negotiated between teacher and students rather than being solely predetermined by the teacher." This sort of practice values collaboration, democracy, and social justice, and supports the view that students who have the capacity to be heard, resist, and question in their classrooms will ultimately learn better. I conducted my curriculum negotiation experiment with my advanced interdisciplinary seminar class on computational creativity, a class I proposed to explore the intersection of computation and art. Because this class had never been taught before, I did have a fair amount of curricular leeway. I worked with 7 students, 2 sophomores, 3 juniors, and 2 seniors. I didn't expect my students to come into class on the first day ready to negotiate the curriculum. Instead, I provided scaffolding in order to get them to a point where they knew what they wanted to learn, how they wanted to learn, and how they could share their learning. For the first few days of class, my students dissected learning through various activities. For instance, I had them share something they learned over the summer, how they learned it, and how they knew that they learned it. We discussed positive and negative educational experiences and identified different features that were common across multiple experiences. I even had all of my students work together to come up with a definition of learning and a visual representation. These activities, among others, laid the groundwork for the heart of the class, learning cycles. For each learning cycle, students would identify a question about computational creativity with the goal of answering this question to the best of their ability and sharing their learning with the class. Then we would negotiate the timeline and rubric with me and their peers. They would work in small groups to answer the question, perhaps renegotiate along the way, share out their findings, and finally reflect on the process. For the first learning cycle, students chose to share out their learning using a more traditional lecture or slideshow format. However, when we reflected on this choice, students decided that they wanted to teach a full 90-minute class for the next cycle where they were able to bring in different activities. I was able to understand the effects of curriculum negotiation through multiple data sources, such as observation notes, classroom artifacts, and student journals. From these different perspectives, my findings emerged. My first finding is that curriculum negotiation encourages students to view their peers as valid sources of knowledge and themselves as teachers. In a traditional classroom, the engagement network might look more like this image. The students on the outside are primarily listening to and engaging with the teacher, highlighted in green in the center. In a classroom where curriculum negotiation is taking place, however, the engagement might look more like this. Students and teacher are all engaging with each other in order to reach agreements about the curriculum, as the process of collective decision-making requires participants to actually listen to each other. Throughout the trimester, students became better listeners and more invested in hearing what their peers had to say. One student, in her daily end-of-class journal reflection, wrote the following: "There were moments where I had to remind myself not to respond immediately in order to truly understand what the other person was saying." Students also started to think of themselves as teachers. An outside observer of my class wrote that students were able to generate rationales about the activities they were planning and why it would help their peers' learning. My second finding is that curriculum negotiation radically reconfigured power in the classroom, allowing my students to surprise me. When I first started teaching, surprise had a negative connotation, implying that something did not go to plan. In contrast, curriculum negotiation taught me to embrace surprise. For example, one day during class, a student asked a hypothetical question about romantic relationships between humans and artificially intelligent chatbots. This spurred a fascinating conversation where we talked about AI companionship and even AI influencers and celebrities, and ended up influencing the questions that students asked in the subsequent learning cycle. Notably, this is not a topic I would have ever thought to bring up in class. At the end of class, one of my students articulated how she experienced the reconfiguration of power in our classroom through a note that she wrote me. She writes that I acted as a teacher/peer to her, which shows me that my students were cognizant of the more equitable relationship I was trying to cultivate with them. My final finding is that curriculum negotiation blurred the boundaries between class and real life. Students began to see how the course content showed up in their lives outside of the classroom. At the end of the class, I sent out an email with some final logistics. Surprisingly, students continued to reply to this email over their Thanksgiving break by sharing current events or other things related to the course. The most meaningful way, though, that curriculum negotiation made an impact beyond the classroom was through the community of learners that my students and I were able to co-create. As one of my students put it, although the subject of this email chain is a few last things, it seems like the connections we made never ended. For me, the biggest implication of this project is also the simplest. I found that curriculum negotiation in a high school classroom is not only possible, but results in deep engagement with peers and with course content. I've continued to teach 3 different courses since this class that I did my inquiry with, and I've implemented different versions of curriculum negotiation in each of them. Even if you're not able to negotiate all of the curriculum, simply inviting students to make decisions with you can reconfigure power structures in your classroom. Thank you, firstly, to my students for making this project possible, and thank you for your engagement.